Battlefield 5 is the first game to feature Nvidia's RTX that we've been talking about for quite some time now, so finally we can independently test this and determine whether or not it's worth it. Now, of course, there are already videos up online of RTX gameplay in Battlefield 5, but what I wanted to do today is a bit different. I want to run a side-by-side comparison, a complete blind test, to see whether or not you can actually tell the difference between those same clips. So here, RTX on only enables ray traced reflections, so that's what most of what we're going to be looking at today, but keep in mind we may also see ray trace shadows and deep learning super sampling in the future updates. Personally, I feel that ray traced reflections are going to have the least impact visually, but I'll save the rest of my thoughts for after the comparisons. So the following side-by-side comparisons show virtually identical clips, basically as close as I could get them, both at ultra settings at 1080p resolution, and I have set the ray traced reflections to ultra here, but keep in mind you can also set to low, medium, or high. Given that we're testing with a 2080 Ti here, I'm guessing that ultra should be fine. So here we go, feel free to pause the video, and I do recommend adjusting the playback resolution as high as possible, at least 1080p. Alright, so the results are definitely closer than I expected. RTX was enabled on the left side of the screen for the entire comparison, with RTX off on the right side. And the biggest takeaway for me personally after doing these side-by-side comparisons is that I didn't realize how convincing the RTX off gameplay actually was in terms of realistic reflections. And there was many times during the testing that I actually had to double check my settings to make sure that it was actually disabled. Of course, since we are just looking at reflections here, the differences that you should be looking out for between the two comparisons are the surfaces of highly glossy and reflective materials, for example on the surface of the ocean, puddles, metal, windows, and also the player's weapon. Again though, the Frostbite engine already generates reflections extremely well, as you can see in this RTX off gameplay here. The lighting and reflections on the weapons are already very convincing and realistic, and in my opinion, the reflections on water surfaces are already quite good. The biggest difference between the RTX off and RTX on clips is the level of detail and accuracy on the reflections of puddles of water. Now, if you're actually going to be playing the game like you should, which is looking out for enemies, capturing objectives, you're not going to be staring at puddles of water on the floor, and you're honestly not going to notice the difference. Still though, with ray traced reflections enabled, RTX on definitely looks better and more realistic. With traditional reflections, it's not perfect, but it's not trying to be. It's just trying to be good enough and efficient enough. For those people who are going to be pixel peeping in the puddle reflections, you will notice some artifacting and imperfections from traditional screen space reflections. For example, blocking the reflected object with your gun and even aiming down the sights will cause the reflections in water to completely disappear. This can actually be seen in one of the side-by-side comparisons where a soldier crosses the puddle in both captures, and if you were paying attention, you'd be able to see the reflection from the stone behind him disappear. This is because since that part of the stone is no longer in the camera's view, it doesn't reflect it. With RTX though, the reflection is definitely crisp, accurate, and surely realistic. As some of you may know though, ray tracing is not a computationally efficient method compared to traditional methods that are currently in games, because you're taking so many ray samples and then also processing denoising on top of that. The current performance in Battlefield 5 is pretty much unplayable with RTX enabled. And I'm using one of the fastest RTX 2080 Ti's available, Gigabyte's Aorus Extreme, and even even that couldn't comfortably run the game with RTX enabled above 60 FPS and at just 1080p resolution. I've included the FPS counter here in the top left hand corner, and it's basically sitting at around 50 to 55 FPS the entire time, whereas with RTX disabled at 1080p, the 2080 Ti can pretty much hit the frame cap of this game at 200 FPS. And so I did play a couple of rounds of multiplayer with RTX enabled, and although I did catch a nice reflection here and there, especially on the map Rotterdam where there are a ton of puddles on the floor, the biggest difference that I personally noticed when it came to actual gameplay was the absurdly slower FPS with RTX on. With RTX enabled, the game was stuttering consistently, it felt extremely choppy, and was by no means the immersive experience that it sets out to achieve. It's also important to note that the maps where there aren't puddles of water or metallic surfaces, there is pretty much going to be no difference at all between RTX on or off, at least in Battlefield 5's current state. And so now for some closing thoughts while we wrap things up. And first of all, there are aspects of ray trace reflections that I think are pretty awesome in Battlefield 5. The result can be pretty much flawless in most instances, and this is no doubt an important step for the future of PC gaming. However, the performance and usefulness is just not there yet, and honestly, I think it will be quite some time before users will be purchasing RTX cards to actually use RTX in games. And lastly, I will mention that the way that RTX off gaming and traditional in-game reflections has been portrayed in Nvidia's marketing material has been extremely misleading. Even with RTX off, reflections and lighting look extremely convincing whilst actually playing the game, using cube maps and screen space reflection, which is incredibly efficient in comparison. So guys, I'd love to hear your thoughts down below on Nvidia's RTX platform and whether you think it's heading in the right direction. Personally, I think that progress has been extremely slow, and that's not anything against the engineers or developers. They've done amazing work to get to this point. It's just considering that we've had these RTX cards for so many months now, and all Nvidia has to show for it are 1 or 2 games with really one instance of ray tracing. So guys, a huge thanks for watching. Subscribe down below if you haven't already, and I'll see you all in the next one.